Hello and welcome to Extra Time. This is the first episode in our 4-part series taking a deep dive into the subject of football governance. It's a big one, but Tom, we're really looking forward to it, and we're delighted to be here at Muckle HQ alongside two of our colleagues who have provided lots and lots of support for clubs up and down the country. It's a very warm welcome to Alison and to Ryan. I mean, first things first, tell us a little bit about your jobs and the support that, as I mentioned there, you provide to so many of our accredited England football clubs.
Oh yeah, we are proud legal advisors, aren't we, to the FA? So yes, I'm Allison, as you mentioned, and I'm a senior associate in the sports team. I've been here for 2.5 years, and yes, we love working with the FA.
We do. I'm Ryan. I'm a paralegal in the sports team here. I've been here just under 4 years. Work with Alison all the time.
Alison, Ryan, let's dig straight into this and begin with the basics, really. My first question to you is, what is personal data? Can you give us a bit of a definition and description of it?
Can I take the easiest questions?
All for it.
Okay. So essentially, personal data is personal information that relates, an important word, isn't it? That relates to an identifiable living person. So it could be any personal information that relates to your coaches, for example, or players. And when we have clubs that come to us, the first thing they always think of, it's just names and email addresses, for example. But as I mentioned before, the word relates, personal information is actually much, much broader than that, isn't it?
Yeah, so even if you think of like an email, so an email might refer to me as the legal advisor from Muckle in a navy polo top. That email might not say my name at all, but just because you can work out who it's talking about in that email, that could become my personal data. So it's all about if it can identify a person rather than if it just uses sort of the bog standard things you might think of, so names or email addresses or anything like that.
Oh, I love that example.
And what springs to mind when you were talking about it for me is obviously them 4 little letters of GDPR.
Oh my gosh, yeah. That is, I remember a few years ago, everyone was scrambling to become GDPR compliant. And then we had Brexit, which through now we've got the UK GDPR. But there's actually a few pieces of legislation that we need to comply with from a data protection perspective. And essentially all that information or all that legislation is designed to control organisations and how they process personal data. So how long they process it for, how they store it, make sure they process it fairly and lawfully. So there's quite a lot of restrictions around how the information is used, essentially. And I suppose when GDPR came out, everyone was worried about these big fines that could be levied, and yet in theory those fines could be levied. But I think from like a day-to-day perspective, if clubs aren't complying with data protection legislation, we find, don't we, that the biggest repercussions normally are like damage to reputation, or you might have someone that's really disgruntled, like a disgruntled parent of a player, for example, and they can cause quite a lot of difficulty for clubs in terms of dealing with the complaints. And you know, people at clubs are normally volunteers, so it takes a lot of time and energy in dealing with those complaints. So yeah, it's really important that we comply with data protection legislation. And I suppose one thing to remember is data protection legislation is all about how organisations process information. And process is defined really broadly. So it's anything like using information, storing it, deleting it, sharing it. So basically anything that you do with personal information is covered by the legislation.
I can remember, like you mentioned, when the GDPR laws were reinforced and so many volunteers and clubs really didn't know where to start. But the principle that I came away from anyway was just learning, if you're responsible and proactive, you'll be fine. And I think that mindset's really important. And sometimes it can be a little bit intimidating / slightly confusing for volunteers when you've got all these different acronyms. So from GDPR, one that I've made a note here to ask you about is an SAR. What is it? Why does it matter to football volunteers? Can you explain a bit more?
Yeah, of course. So coming back to the GDPR, as part of that, what you find is that people have certain rights in relation to the personal data. And one of the most common ones that you get is a right to request any information that someone holds about you. So that's known as a subject access request, or a SAR, which is a lot less of a mouthful. A SAR is basically just anybody can request information that you hold about them. For a youth football club, it might also be parents asking for any information that you hold about their children. The key thing to remember about a SAR is that it can be made in any way. So it could be verbal, it could be an email, it could even be a message on social media. And what can be tricky for clubs is that they don't need to use the word SAR at all. So it's up to the club to be able to identify when someone's making that request. What we often see is people sort of referring to even a freedom of information request. That's a completely separate thing. But if in reality they were actually asking for a SAR and the club doesn't respond, the club might end up getting penalties for that. So it's important to be able to recognise when someone is asking for that.
Yeah, Ryan, could you give us then a bit of an example of that? So perhaps if you're a club secretary, could an email land saying, like, how would that perhaps look and sound to a volunteer?
So it's tricky, and it all depends on the context. So an email might just say, have you got a copy of Ryan's sort of consent records that you took sort of a year ago? And they might just think, oh yeah, like, I'll pull it out of whatever, they might forget about it. But if that doesn't get dealt with properly, it might seem like such a simple request, but if it doesn't get dealt with properly, and if that gets escalated up to sort of the regulator, for example, the club could get big penalties for that. So they really need to be reading through and taking requests seriously. I think it's easy to just consider personal data as something that no one really cares about, but obviously the UK GDPR has completely changed that approach. You need to think of it as like, this belongs to someone.
Yeah, really taking care of it.
Yeah.
Like you would if a player had an injury or something
It's
like that.
If you borrowed someone's pet, you would look after it, wouldn't you?
Yeah, that's a really good example. Really good example.
Is there any sort of top tips when they do come in terms of like how they could document it and evidence it, and do you have to sort of give back to that individual the steps that you've actually taken in terms of trying to find any data or information you hold on them?
Oh, that's a good question. Top tips then. Yeah. I would always say when someone receives a subject access request, the first thing is just don't panic. And we find a lot of clubs do panic because the volunteers, or they're not used to data protection legislation, they just don't know what to do. So the first thing is don't panic. It can seem daunting, but it isn't really as difficult as it may seem to deal with. And when clubs come to me, I always ask them the first question is, when did you receive it? So like Ryan said, you need to respond within the relevant time frame. So as a rule of thumb, it's 1 calendar month. So the first thing is just to make sure you diarise and respond within the statutory deadline. And actually a lot of clubs come to us as well and say, I don't really understand what they've asked for here. And it is perfectly fine to go back and say, can you give me some clarity around exactly what you want? Or some people get requests and they don't know who's made the request, don't they? So we say, well, just go back and ask for ID or find out who this person is. So yeah, for me, I would say don't panic, diarise the deadline for responding, and ask for clarity if needed.
Yeah, and then when it comes to actually looking for the information that's requested for, you are only required to do a reasonable and proportionate search. So it's not necessarily like you need to go to the ends of the earth to try and uncover anything you've ever held about someone. I think it's difficult to advise on what exactly that'll be because it always depends on the context. If the club's really, really large, it's obviously might need to do a larger search across more information it holds. But I think the key is just to really remember that you're not expected to sort of go above and beyond and spend hours and hours and hours, but you do have to be able to justify what that reasonable and proportionate search has been.
I think that's going to reassure a lot of people as well, because like I said at the very start, it can feel a little bit daunting, it can feel intimidating. This is people's data, it's their private information. Anyone listening to this will want to take care of that and be responsible, which leads me quite nicely to the subject of privacy notices, because that again is a term that we find creeps into particularly those that administer at football clubs. So what is a privacy notice, and is it something you would recommend all football clubs to have? Yeah,
I would say it's a legal requirement, so everyone should have it, and it actually feeds back into the point about the subject access request, because a lot of people forget that as well as giving the person who's made the request the information that they've asked for, there's also a load of supplementary information that has to be given, and normally that supplementary information is contained in your privacy notice.
That's so if it's been drafted properly.
Yes, exactly. If we've drafted it, it would be in there. But then what you would do is you would respond with your covering letter or email, attach the information that they've asked for, and then attach a copy of your privacy notice. So back to your point, a privacy notice would include things like, I suppose the key thing is like the lawful basis for processing. And what I mean by that, I think most clubs would rely upon consent to use people's personal data. But we're finding nowadays with the change in legislation that consent is, I tend to steer away from using consent because people can withdraw consent as easily as they can give it. So there are other legal bases like legitimate interest, for example. So I definitely recommend if clubs don't have a privacy notice, they put one in place. And if they've got one, have a look at the lawful basis, because consent is not necessarily the best lawful basis to rely upon.
And just to go back to SARs again, sorry to keep going back to that.
No, but it shows how it all links together as well, doesn't it?
And when we're talking about that search that clubs need to do, sometimes we get asked whether they need to sort of check private emails between officials of the club, or like WhatsApp messages, or even CCTV footage. And again, that's difficult to say because it can depend on a number of factors, but one of them would be what they've got in the privacy notice. So if the committee's got a good understanding of what that says, hopefully it should give them confidence to how to deal with sort of some of these things that we're talking about now.
So there's an action for everyone
Yeah.
watching this. Make sure that you have a privacy notice at your football club. I didn't realise it was as kind of black and white as you have to have one. So, and also for people to review and make sure that it is suitable for the needs of their club sounds quite important as well.
Yeah, I think the message is as well that if you haven't got one currently, don't panic.
Yeah.
And if you just go to the FA section on the Muckle website, there's loads of templates and loads of guidance on there. And
Yeah, we can put those in the description as well.
We certainly can, and hence the reason why we've started with this subject.
And what I'm sure a lot of people would find is if they read the privacy notice, it might help them familiarise themselves with some of the terms that come across in data protection law, because it's very abstract and not everyone knows it, but the privacy policy or notice, it's meant to be sort of black and white, like this is a guide that you can follow.
Yeah. Well, look, you've given us plenty to digest, and part of this as well is bringing the experiences that you have at your football clubs. I was delighted to have a catch up with Castle Colts, who you guys have helped on this subject. So let's have a little watch now. Leigh, thank you so much for joining us. I think at the FA, the gratitude that's felt towards volunteers is immense, and we fully understand that volunteers like yourself, you have your own day jobs, you have so much going on, and far beyond your remit is thinking or even considering about various legal experts and expertise. So before you got engaged with Muckle, how would you describe your sort of knowledge around data protection and the obligations around GDPR? Because I feel like people have kind of heard of GDPR, but like actual understanding of it could be quite a different thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Very limited. I do a lot of my day job is around recruitment. So I do have some knowledge on information that can be shared and, what you don't share. But it was in the football club format, it was very, very limited. And also to get the subject access request, the first thing I had to do was Google it, because I had absolutely no idea what a subject access request was. So Google was my friend. A lot of reading about it, a lot of panicking, because it was, when you're reading it, it's quite daunting. But yeah, very GDPR information, that sort of thing, very, very limited.
And at Castle Colts, had any sort of data issues cropped up previously?
Not all the time that I've been a welfare officer. So I've been now doing the welfare officer for nearly 5 years. And I've never had anything to do with sort of data protection, anything like that. Nothing had been brought to our door. So no knowledge of it.
And can you tell us how and why you turned to Muckle for some support around data protection, and what was your experience like working with them?
So first of all, I contacted our county FA just to get some other advice in the types of information that I could share and what would be expected to be shared within this subject access request. They were a great help. And then they suggested about contacting Muckle, which up until that point, I wasn't aware that Muckle was there to turn to. The county FA then agreed that they would allow me some time with Muckle, which they would fund, because this was the first time that we'd ever come across a subject access request. And then the contact with Muckle was done over the phone. Arranged a time and a day that was convenient for me. And then I literally had an hour, which I don't even think I used anywhere near an hour, where I had the opportunity to ask any question that I needed to ask regarding information around a subject access request.
Amazing. So it sounds like you used that initial hour really, really well. What key thing did you take away from that conversation? Or I suppose the way that this issue of data protection, you've mentioned you've been on a learning curve. What's been that key takeaway for you?
I think when I come off that call, it was very much common sense, and what I was thinking was right. And that I think sometimes we doubt ourselves because you read something that probably comes across really complicated and quite scary because it's dealing with people's information, people's data, and you don't want to get it wrong. But after I spoke to Muckle, everything I was asking, I was sort of using my own common sense, and they basically agreed that what I was thinking was the right thing. And I think just coming away with that confirmation that actually, yes, it was something a little bit, quite scary at the time to deal with, that actually you just put the trust in yourself as well. And that if you've read some information, you've, Googled it or whatever, and you've read some information about it, your thought process will probably be spot on. So, but just having Muckle there to confirm my thought process and how I felt that I needed to deal with this situation, just having that there was a great help.
You mentioned the word daunting earlier, and I'm sure there's lots of volunteers across the country when they tackle subjects like data protection. As you highlighted, you want to be as thorough, considerate, and sometimes as cautious as possible. But it is important to take that sort of fear, I suppose, put it to one side and be proactive to make sure that you are following the right steps on such an important matter around club welfare it links back to, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think sometimes because you're volunteering, you feel like you're on your own within that group of people that you're with. So the club, sometimes you can feel quite isolated. But actually knowing that you've got your county FA, knowing that you've got the leagues, or knowing that, now I know that we've got Muckle there, that we can sort of tap into, you're not on your own. But you feel, because it's something separate to your day job, when you're doing your day job, what department you need to go for, specific things. But when you're volunteering and you can feel quite isolated, you're not too sure where to go. So, first thing, speak to your county FA and they will be able to guide you in the different directions that you need to go.
Leigh, you've given us some brilliant advice already, but I suppose a final question to you. If there was one tip that you would like other volunteers to know that you feel would really be beneficial and useful to them, what would that one tip be?
I think it's one, know that your common sense is probably going to be the right answer, but also use your county FA. And if it's anything, to do with data protection or anything like that, that you've got to get it right, then obviously tap into Muckle there, because they will give you that advice, they will give you that guidance, and don't be frightened to use it.
Brilliant advice, Leigh. Thank you so much for your time, and all the best for the season for Castle Colts as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to the team at Castle Colts there for sharing that experience with us and what they've been through. And again, it just really highlights how valuable it is to take care of data, and the data almost takes care of itself. But there is part of this that I wanted to ask you about, Alison, and it's around redactions. And can you tell us a little bit, again, in terms of this club landscape, what that means when it comes to data and how people are looking after the requests they get and so on?
I love a bit of redaction. And
Black
you do with your black
marker.
marker. I suppose going back to Ryan's point, once you've collated all the information and you've done your reasonable and proportionate search for all the information, the next thing to think about, and again, clubs tend to panic about this, but it is quite straightforward, is to think about when you look through the information, remember that people are only entitled to their own personal information. So anything in these documents and emails and letters that isn't their own personal information, get your black marker out and redact it. There are exemptions in law which would allow you to redact, and the most common one is a third-party redaction. So if I made a subject access request and there was that sentence in there about Ryan and his blue polo top, then I would redact that, or you would redact that because that doesn't relate to me. So yeah, the key thing is once you've got the information, make sure you only supply that person with their own personal data. So that's where your black marker comes out.
And that makes sense. And sort of going back to listening to Castle Colts there, what would be your top tips on if a data breach does happen at a football club?
Touch wood, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Not much, but there you go.
Yeah.
I think what's really important to bear in mind is that a data breach doesn't need to be malicious. So it might not be that you've been hacked or that there's been some sort of cyber attack or a failure on your security. I think the most common data breaches that we come across are accidental. Yeah. So in that, it could be something as easy as sending an email to the wrong person. I think everyone's done that. If mistakes happen, be honest about it. I think that's the key thing to bear in mind.
I would say probably not top tips, but maybe top questions that we always think about if a club comes to us with a potential data breach. I think the first thing is to think about, has a breach occurred or what type of breach has occurred, like the examples that you've just given. What's the likelihood and impact of that breach having an impact on somebody? What steps can we take to mitigate the breach? Do we need to inform the regulator or regulators if you're a charity? And I suppose for me, I always think it's better to over-report than under-report. Do we need to inform the individual who's being impacted or individuals? Sometimes they can take steps to protect themselves. So, for example, if it was financial data that had been leaked, they could go to the bank and cancel their cards, for example. And I suppose once you've controlled the breach or put in steps to mitigate it, think about learning points. So what can we do next time to prevent this from happening again?
And just finally to add there, obviously, if you do work through all those questions that Alison just said, make sure that you're monitoring your responses. Just if anyone ever asks, you've got them there for audit purposes. Yeah, got to keep a paper trail.
Yeah.
And we know our clubs have great administrators that are very well organised. So obviously bookmark these conversations, these questions to be able to actually put that there. We'll put within the description all the links to where the templates of the guidance are. But Alison, Ryan, thanks ever so much for the conversation. A great start to this 4-part series we've got with yourselves at Muckle.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, all about risk management. You've given us so many good tips. And as Tom said there, do pause, rewind, make notes. We'll put all of the links in the show notes as well. And do make sure that you subscribe to the channel so you're the first to know when our latest episodes drop. This is episode 1 of our 4-part series, so do make sure you stay tuned and we'll see you again very soon.